The ocean remembers things long after people forget. It keeps its secrets tucked beneath rolling waves, hiding stories of courage, fire, steel, and moments when fate itself seemed to hesitate. And somewhere in that vast memory lies the tale of a ship the Japanese tried again and again to destroy, but simply couldn't. A ship that refused to die, a ship that outlasted logic, fear, and even the very men sworn to sink her. But to understand why this single vessel became a legend, we have to go back long before the smoke, the explosions, the screaming engines of enemy pilots diving from the sky. Before the world learned her name, before anyone imagined she would one day stand alone against wave after wave of attacks that should have torn her apart. Her story begins in the quiet years between wars, when steel was still cheap and nations were preparing for a future they prayed would never come. The United States Navy, watching tensions rise in Europe and Asia, needed ships capable of protecting convoys, escorting carriers, and fighting off threats from sea and air. Among the vessels built during that era was a certain destroyer, sleek, fast, compact, and designed with one purpose: survive anything the ocean or the enemy could throw at her. She wasn't the biggest, strongest, or most intimidating ship in the fleet. In fact, at first glance she was nothing extraordinary. A typical destroyer, armed with guns, torpedoes, depth charges, and a crew that was young, eager, and perhaps unaware of just how important their ship would one day become. They polished her rails, memorized every inch of her decks, and learned the hum of her engines the way a musician learns the sound of an instrument. She was theirs, and they were hers. Before long, the world plunged into a conflict that stretched across continents and oceans. The Pacific turned into a battleground, and more ships were thrown into the fire. The Japanese forces were relentless, capable, and feared. They launched torpedoes with terrifying accuracy. Their pilots were skilled, daring, and willing to sacrifice their lives to take down a single enemy ship. Against that kind of determination, even the strongest vessels sometimes didn't stand a chance. Yet through those early years of chaos, this ship survived. She endured storms that cracked steel, skirmishes that tested every gunner's nerve, and the constant threat of submarines lurking beneath the waves. Still, nothing prepared her crew for what awaited them later in the war, when the Japanese would unleash some of the most desperate and determined attacks ever witnessed at sea. The ship's reputation didn't grow from a single moment. It built slowly, mission after mission, as she escorted carriers through skies that thundered with enemy aircraft, as she protected other ships battered by torpedoes, as she fired until her guns glowed red, and the men behind them could barely stand from exhaustion. She wasn't just a weapon, she was a shield, one that seemed, time after time, to survive hits that should have been fatal. By the time she approached the battles that would define her legacy, the crew had formed an unbreakable bond with their vessel. They slept beneath her steel plates, ate in her narrow mess hall, laughed on her decks when the sea was calm, and held their breath in the dark moments when alarms sounded and the sky filled with the distant drone of incoming engines. They trusted her, and though ships don't have hearts, it almost felt like she trusted them back. Outside, the Pacific War was reaching its most brutal chapter. The Japanese military, pushed back toward their homeland, resorted to increasingly fierce tactics. Kamikaze attacks, pilots choosing to crash their planes directly into American ships, had become terrifyingly common. These attacks weren't just explosive, they were personal, desperate, and meant to break the spirit of anyone who witnessed them. Many ships didn't survive even one, but soon one destroyer would face not just one of these attacks, not two, but wave after wave, a storm of fire and steel the likes of which few ships in history had ever endured. The Japanese believed sheer determination could sink her. They believed no ship could withstand what they were about to unleash. They were wrong. The stage was set. The tension in the Pacific was boiling. The crew didn't know it yet, but they were about to enter a battle that would test every ounce of courage they had and push their beloved ship to the very edge of destruction. This is the ship the Japanese couldn't sink, and her story was only just beginning. By the time dawn crept over the horizon on the day that would determine the ship's fate, the crew sensed something different in the air. The sky was too quiet, the sea too calm, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Men moved along the decks with a tension they tried to hide, tightening ropes, checking ammunition, adjusting helmets. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Today would be bad. Today would test them more than any battle before. Word had spread. Japanese forces were preparing a massive strike, more aircraft, more pilots, more desperation than any previous assault in the region. This destroyer, tasked with screening larger ships, found itself positioned in a place no one wanted to be, out on the edge, where the first wave of attackers would come screaming down from the sky. It was a job that demanded stubbornness, speed, and a willingness to fight until the guns ran dry. And fortunately, stubbornness was something this ship had in endless supply. The first distant hum of engines reached the radar operators before the men on deck could hear it. A low, droning vibration that felt like a warning from far over the horizon. Within minutes, alarms erupted. Men ran to their stations. The ship's guns swung upward, tracking the incoming specks that grew larger with every second. The ocean, moments before calm and glistening, now felt like a stage set for chaos. Then it began. The first Japanese plane dove out of the sky with terrifying speed, its engine shrieking as if it were alive. Gunners fired in rapid bursts, tracers carving bright lines through the sky. The destroyer heaved sharply as it maneuvered at full throttle, trying to throw off the attacker's aim. The plane burst into flames just seconds before crashing into the water, sending a plume of spray across the deck. Cheers erupted, but only for a moment. More engines were approaching. Many more. Wave after wave came. Some were shot down so close that burning debris rained onto the deck. Others skimmed across the ocean, trying to strike from low angles. The crew worked with mechanical precision, shouting coordinates, loading ammunition, spraying fire skyward until their arms quivered. Heat rolled off the guns. Smoke stung their eyes. Their ears rang with the relentless roar of combat. And yet, despite the chaos, the destroyer held. One plane struck the ship squarely, smashing into her side with a sickening crunch. Metal twisted, fire erupted. But somehow, impossibly, she stayed afloat. The crew rushed to extinguish the flames, dragging hoses through the heat, coughing through thick smoke. As soon as the worst was under control, they went right back to the guns, ready for the next attack. Another plane dove toward the forward deck, its wings clipped by gunfire. It spiraled wildly and slammed into the water so close that the shockwave nearly knocked men off their feet. Still, the ship pressed forward, carving through the sea like a wounded animal refusing to stop running. What made this ship so resilient? Some said it was the way she was built, solid, balanced, tough. Others said it was the crew, who acted with such fierce determination that it felt as if they willed the ship to stay alive. But many sailors who served on nearby vessels insisted there was something else, luck, fate, or perhaps something deeper. Again and again, this destroyer was struck, battered, burned, but never broken. As the hours dragged on, the battle only intensified. Planes came from every direction, trying to overwhelm the ship's defenses. The Japanese pilots were skilled and fearless, diving through walls of gunfire, determined to hit their mark. Some got through. Explosions rattled the hull. Flames licked the metal. Yet with every hit, the crew responded like a single living thing, sealing compartments, treating the wounded, dragging heavy debris aside so the guns could keep firing. At one point, the ship was so covered in smoke that nearby American vessels believed she had finally gone under. But through that thick veil, she emerged listing, scarred, missing railings and equipment but still moving, still fighting. Stories circulated among the fleet. Sailors whispered that the ship had taken more hits than any destroyer should survive. Some claimed they saw her rise out of explosions that should have torn her apart. A few joked that she must have been built from something not entirely of this world, though no one said that too loudly, knowing the crew aboard her had paid a steep price for every miraculous survival. Amid the destruction, a few remarkable moments stood out. One gunner, surrounded by flames, kept firing his weapon even as burning debris fell around him, refusing to abandon his post. Another man, knocked unconscious by a blast, woke only minutes later and staggered back to his station as if pulled there by instinct alone. These were ordinary sailors turned extraordinary by a battle that demanded everything they had. Through it all, the ship's commander maintained a steady voice, calling out orders with a calm that helped anchor the chaos. He told his crew the ship would not fall today, that they would make it through, that they had more strength than they realized. Whether he fully believed it didn't matter. The men believed it, and so the ship kept fighting. Hours into the onslaught, something astonishing became clear. Despite the relentless assault, despite the hits and fires and near misses, the destroyer had not only survived, she had saved the lives of countless sailors on larger ships behind her. By drawing so many attackers toward herself, she shielded the rest of the fleet from blows that could have changed the course of the battle. And still, the attacks were not over. More planes were forming on the horizon, preparing for yet another strike. The ship's fate hung in the balance. She had endured the unimaginable, but every vessel, no matter how tough, has limits. How much more could she take? How many more hits could she survive before her luck finally ran out? That answer lay in the final chapter of her story, one that would push the ship and her exhausted crew to the brink of total destruction. The final wave approached like a dark cloud sweeping across the sky, a moving wall of engines and steel. Men who had been fighting for hours gripped their weapons tighter, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Their faces were streaked with sweat, soot, and salt water. Some had bandages wrapped around their arms or heads, but they refused to leave their posts. They had come too far, fought too hard, to let the ship fall now. The destroyer crawled through the sea, wounded but unbroken. Smoke drifted from her stacks in uneven bursts. Plates along her hull were bent and scorched. Parts of her deck looked as though a giant hand had crushed them inward, yet the engines still worked, the rudder still obeyed, and the spirit running through her steel bones burned brighter than ever. When the new group of Japanese planes descended, it was clear these pilots intended to finish what the earlier waves could not. They attacked with brutal precision, singling out the destroyer as if she were the only ship on the ocean. It felt personal. Each dive seemed aimed not just at defeating her, but at erasing her from existence entirely. The first of the final attackers streaked in from high above, diving almost vertically. The gunners fired everything they had, and the plane exploded in a fiery blossom overhead. But pieces of shrapnel rained down, tearing into the deck like angry sparks. Men ducked and instinctively shielded one another, but as soon as the debris settled, they went right back to firing. Another plane swooped low across the water, so close that its reflection skimmed the surface. The destroyer jerked sharply to one side, trying to evade it. Her engines groaned, pushing far beyond what they were meant to do. The ship's bow sliced through a wave like a blade, soaking the forward guns in cold spray. The plane crashed just behind her stern, the explosion sending a violent tremor through the hull. Still, she pressed on. But the hardest moment came when a kamikaze pilot managed to break through the defensive fire entirely. His plane struck near the ship's center with a deafening roar, tearing open metal, flinging men off their feet, and engulfing a section of the deck in flames so intense they turned the sky orange. For a few breathless seconds, it looked as if the destroyer might finally give in. The shock nearly stopped her in the water. Yet even in that moment of crushing impact, she refused to die. The crew scrambled through smoke and heat, pulling away flaming wreckage with bare hands, shouting for extinguishers, dragging hoses across twisted steel. Flames crept along the deck, threatening ammunition stores. Men coughed, stumbled, and fought through the choking haze. Still, the water surged over the side as pumps roared to life. Buckets passed from hand to hand. What mattered was survival, nothing else. The commander, bruised and bleeding from the blast, forced himself to stand. He issued orders with the same steady voice he had used since dawn, guiding his crew as if the ship were still whole and strong. Something in his tone steadied the men around him. If he could still stand, then so could they. Minutes felt like hours. The fire raged, the ocean churned, the sky trembled with the roar of distant engines that might soon return. And all the while, the destroyer kept moving, inch by stubborn inch, as though pulled forward by pure defiance. When the last flames finally died and the smoke drifted away in slow grey curls, the crew looked around and tried to piece together what was left. Railings were missing, antennas lay twisted, gun mounts were scorched and bent, the decks were battered. The hull bore wounds deep enough to have sunk other ships instantly, but she was still afloat. The ocean, which had seemed like an enemy all day, now felt strangely calm, as if offering a moment of quiet after the storm. Men slumped against whatever they could find, breathing hard, staring at the horizon where the attacking planes had vanished. Some trembled from adrenaline, others simply closed their eyes. A few wept, not from fear or pain, but from the overwhelming realization that they had survived something that should have destroyed them. Later, when other American ships came closer, they stared in disbelief at the destroyer that refused to sink. They called her a miracle, a ghost ship, a steel legend. They counted the impact points and shook their heads. They photographed the damage, marveled at her survival, and tried to understand how she was still upright. The crew didn't care about becoming legends. They were too tired, too grateful, too stunned to think about what their story would mean to future generations. They only knew that they were alive, and that their ship, against every possible expectation, had carried them through the fire. In the days that followed, stories of the destroyer spread across the fleet. Sailors whispered about her in mess halls and on night watches. Commanders sent reports filled with disbelief. Even enemy intelligence, upon learning how many attacks she had endured, reluctantly acknowledged her resilience. Some people say ships don't have personalities, or souls, or anything resembling a heartbeat, but anyone who served on that destroyer would tell you otherwise. They would say that she fought with them, bled with them, suffered with them, that she refused to surrender because they refused to surrender, that she was more than steel plates and rivets, she was a survivor. Eventually, she limped back to port for repairs. Crowds stood in stunned silence as she arrived, battered yet unbroken. Workers paused their tasks just to stare. Officers shook their heads, and young recruits, seeing her scars, realized for the first time what true endurance looked like. The destroyer's legacy didn't come from her size, her firepower, or her place in naval hierarchy. It came from the simple, stubborn fact that she would not sink. No matter how many times she was hit, no matter how overwhelming the odds, she kept moving forward. Her story became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, resilience can turn the tide. That courage isn't loud or boastful, it's quiet, steady, and unyielding. It's a crew standing their ground. It's steel holding together when logic says it should fall apart. And long after the war ended, long after her crew went home and the ocean swallowed the echoes of battle, her legend lived on. She was the ship the Japanese couldn't sink, a ship that proved survival is sometimes the greatest victory of all.